Do you have the... Thanks. Okay.
Very good presentation, Sean. Must congratulate you. A quick one is, what have we learned, IMF, from the previous Millennium Development Goals, and how will it affect the future Millennium Development Goals? And what have we learned with this commodity crash and the effect of these problems to the LIDCs? And the final one is, how is it going to affect Nigeria and especially to Pakistan?
Okay. Someone here, did you want to ask a question? Maybe we have some this side as well. Anyone got questions here?
A question about potential reform. My name is Andy Hinsley from DFID. How much does the fund view this as a good opportunity for reform of national savings, sovereign wealth funds? You mentioned Nigeria, and they did have a sovereign wealth fund in place, helped them in the last crisis, but over the last 4 or 5 years, they really didn't save anything in that, resulting in where they are now. How much should we be pushing these things to be really locked down legislatively while prices are low? Similarly with fuel subsidies, how much should we be pushing on? We as donors and you as the fund be pushing on these things to be reformed while prices are low?
And maybe I can ask people to introduce themselves as well, so I should have said that at the beginning. Is there someone over here who'd like to take a question? No, I don't see any hands. Dirk?
Thank you, Dirk de Velde from ODI. I really enjoyed the presentations. There are a lot of things happening in the world economy, and I don't see that sense of urgency coming through of needing to deal with this. So you've got the commodity price shocks, there's the increased cost of capital that you've mentioned, there's the impact of a China rebalancing. There are probably a range of other shocks as well. There's the debt. The increased debt in a number of countries. Surely there must be some countries that are really beginning to feel the problems now. And I didn't see the sense of urgency coming out of the presentation. Are you not feeling concerned about some of the countries? I mean, we mentioned Nigeria is one of the countries. I'm wondering sort of what you think on this. Kenya. What do you see happening in Kenya? And one of the areas that you mentioned in the slide was about the impact of sovereign bonds financing on how much is going to investment, how much is going to consumption. And you had a number there for portfolio inflows that was going mostly to consumption rather than investment. I'm wondering what you think about the case of Kenya, for example. What is happening there with the sovereign bonds yields, and how is it being spent? So it's a bit of a question on the sense of urgency here. But secondly, I think you're underselling yourself as well by thinking about when you think about linking to the SDGs, you have an absolutely crucial role there to think about managing shocks for development. And it's not just the IMF that plays an important role, but of course developing countries themselves and other players. Reaching the development goals is dependent, of course, on sort of economic transformation and growth, but it's also on managing shocks. And you can really fall back on your growth performances if you're hit by a big shock. And I think that's where I would like to see much more discussion going on at the moment. Of the countries that are in distress, which countries have to scale down their investment plans, their diversification plans? What problems do they have in terms of governance arrangement at the moment in dealing with these shocks? I'd like to see much more looking into these areas, because those are the areas where they have a crucial bearing on meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, including the leave no one behind narrative. Thanks.
Sean and Stefano, maybe you can take that. And I can also say if anyone's online would like to put a question, please do. I'll pick out some of them as they come through on the next round. Sean.
Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to the blog. You should write it down because it was wonderfully punchy and to the point. Just some quick reactions. The point on migrant remittances and their importance as a sort of a source of inflow is actually very well taken, and it's perhaps a topic we should look at more carefully. We actually didn't look at it very carefully in the context of the short-term macro, because one of the things of the surprising results, I think, of the last six or 7 years is people thought migrant remittances would be very unstable as a source of foreign revenue, and the reverse is actually the case. They're actually quite stable. People, you know, the image that, you know, migrants would be the first people to get fired and they wouldn't be able then to send money home and so forth. That's not what's happened. So that's why we didn't figure it in the short-term macro, which isn't to say that it's not worth actually a standalone analysis of itself. Listening to Liz's points, I agree with her on a lot of them. Even the ones that I even agree with her on the ones she didn't give any ticks on, actually, probably more. A couple of thoughts. It's really important for us to expand access to concessional financing. But actually, I've said this a number of times in meetings with CSOs who look at me in some surprise. But the IMF has no money. This is a problem. Certainly, you say, what do you mean the IMF has no money? Well, remember, all our big operations involve borrowing from one group of our members and lending to another group of our members. So, you know, with the sort of the 1% spread being the cost, that's the stuff that generates the budget of the organization. And then for our concessional lending, we have a sort of a pool of money in the PRGT that's used to provide interest subsidies. But that pool is basically constant, and it's going to be really hard to increase it. So the one way we're going to be able to lend more to more countries actually is going to be via graduation. For example, this year we graduated Nigeria and Vietnam. Not that either had borrowed in a long time, but there's a fixed. We're very different from IDA in that regard, where there's a 3-year replenishment. Here, there's not a replenishment, and indeed, the compromise involved that created this pot of money, which involved allocation of gold sale revenues, involved lots of compromises because some shareholders wanted the gold sales used to build up provisions against possible loan quality issues, etc. So it's a very difficult. We don't have much more. We have no more money to get for the time being. The point on more flexibility on debt sustainability, we learned a lot from a forum here a few weeks ago that I think was jointly organised with DFID on the whole debt sustainability assessment analysis, which we were going through the big review of. We hear I think the really important thing is to get the debt sustainability assessments right. And the first exercise in the review is to see what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong. And the answer is actually, I don't know the answer. It's just, which is actually what will be interesting to look at. If one's getting it right, then I think I would argue that it isn't that one should be, actually the service one should deliver in a debt sustainability assessment is it should be as good as it can be, and then that's it. If you can't spin it as a positive or a negative, you really have to spin it as this is what the numbers throw out. And you have to be, I think, honest and unbiased in your assessment of the investment growth trade-off. That's the service you should deliver. On the Gleneagles scenarios and the I take your point. We would be reluctant. Not reluctant, but as you say, we did a lot of joint work on scaling up, big scaling up, modelling exercises, big scaling up, and what it would do in terms of growth and so forth. I can't see enthusiasm to do it straight away, at least prior to your blog, because if you know what I mean, assuming the money is going to materialize is a real assumption, and I'm not sure that that advocacy role will deliver the money at the end of the day. On SDG follow-up, we actually are closely involved at the moment, and the UN's at the moment are focused on FFD, an annual report on how the FFD commitments are being implemented, and which is a much more natural terrain for us and is one that we're heavily involved in. Your point on Gini coefficients actually is well taken, and I actually like your point about advocacy roles and the role of res reps, and having been a res rep twice myself. On other comments that people have made, what have we learned from the MDGs is a very good question. I think now is the time for, we'll certainly be producing a joint paper with the bank on what we have jointly learned, looking back now that we've hit 2015 is behind us. All I could commit to saying is that it's a question that we will look at. Others would have views and answers to the question. I don't actually have a view or an answer that we would, certainly we have produced. What we've learned from the commodity price collapse is what we knew, which is that commodity prices are very volatile. I actually don't see a strong trend, and indeed in the last few years we've seen a commodities price sort of a super cycle, really, really elevated prices for long. But the real trick is the instability and the fact that it has to be embedded in countries' medium-term planning, which leads straight to the issue of stabilization funds and our sovereign wealth funds. And actually the trick, I don't think, with sovereign wealth funds is how they're designed. It's actually systematically putting the money in, if you follow me, rather than sort of manipulating budget prices or something, budget assumptions to modify the flows. It's actually just building a big stabilization fund is I think, really, really important. And rules won't do it. It really requires buy-in by the government for it to happen. And just lastly, on Dirk's point about sense of urgency, I should stress, and I did it, firstly, I said at the start, this was like looking at given the world picture, looking narrowly at what's the outlook for low-income countries. Anyone who reads the newspapers is aware that the bigger global story is one of substantial uncertainty, and none of it with lots of upside to it. I mean, there's a general gloom, and I wasn't dismissing that at all. I was just leaving that entirely to one side. Your point, though, about being a sense of urgency in the case of individual countries is well taken. I think that's what we try and do in our country operations. But I found your comment very useful because I hadn't thought of things in those terms. And a last point, you make a point about managing shocks as being central in the SDGs, and of course you're absolutely right. I used a shorthand there, which is that in our paper on financing for development, we follow the Monterey approach of what countries need to do and then what the international community needs to do on systemic issues. And country needs to do, number one, is maintain macroeconomic and financial sector stability, because a big macro financial crisis can ruin your whole decade. And I didn't mention that to us is core business. I didn't mention it not because it's not important, it's because it's not something new that we were committing to doing. So that was your emphasis on it is absolutely well taken.
Maybe I can just, Stefan, I'm going to take two very quick questions. And they've got to be really quick because we've only got a few minutes, and then I'll ask you to respond to ones you choose.
Hello, my name's Emma Bergser. I work with the Bretton Woods Project. I'm particularly interested in the policies you mentioned focusing on inclusion and equality, particularly the gender pilots that you were talking about. I'm actually writing a briefing about it this afternoon. So I've been studying the 10 or 11 quite in depth. And now that it's 2016, because those were for 2015, I'm really interested in how you take lessons learned from it, what the process will be for developing them in 2016, and how those decisions will be made. Thanks.
Okay, and Sheila, a 10-second question.
I've been attacked by my...
Yes.
Thank you. Sheila Page, ODI. I wanted to follow up Stefania's vulnerability indices. I mean, I'm very unconvinced by one that can change a lot in a year. I mean, that isn't, to me, that's not vulnerability. That's conjuncture. So don't you need a much more basic one? For example, taking in some of the things Sean said about having a supply of reserves, having a resistance, so that countries that weren't vulnerable when you published this can't possibly be vulnerable now on your index. Because there have been I really was slightly disturbed at how much Sean played down the changes since November. I mean, the change in the forecast for imports by emerging markets between November and the January WEO was 1 percentage point. It was from growing more than developed countries, imports are growing less than developed countries. That is huge, and I don't want indices of vulnerability to change just because of that.
Maybe you'd like to take that, and any other comments you'd like to make? Thank you.
Well, I will start with the pilot. We have been in the process for the last year to do a number of pilots, both on the gender area and the inequality. The pilots on gender have focused mainly on labor participation, female labor participation, and it's been a variety of work done there, from just looking at trend to do more sophisticated analysis, depending on the area and on the country. Now, going forward, what we hope to continue and complete this round of pilots, and try to draw lessons, put together the lessons that we have learned from this pilot and what can teach us for future work. I don't know if Sean wants to add something in this area. So if you are interested in particular to the pilot that we have done, I can tell you bilaterally on the list of countries that we have looked at. But they are all published because they all came out in Article 4s in the surveillance work that we annually do with countries, so either as a box in Article 4s or in selected issues. So in terms of the vulnerability, we exactly look at from vulnerability from different lenses, and that is to give a sense from different aspects what we can learn in the case of, for example, the probability of large decline in growth, and then we look at the debt sustainability assessment, and we also look at the financial. So the idea, and then we also perform shock scenarios. So the idea is to see if we get a comprehensive, or consistent picture across the various indicators and also over time. So what is pointing out, in the presentation, that from all aspects we see that vulnerability have had a sort of turning point in 2014 over the last 2 years.
Could I just add to that? I actually understand where you're coming from in the sense of saying, indicators that reflect deep-rooted vulnerability should change slowly. And at times we are beginning to look again at the methodology, because it certainly to the extent to which you place heavy emphasis on contemporaneous measures, you're going to get the kind of effects that you've described. And whether that's correct or not needs some thinking. So your point is well taken, and it's something that I share the thought. I think the Stefania would still say that the sort of trend story is still, there's information in the trend, even if for an individual country, you might just go down and analyze it and then determine, oh, it's just simply the fact that the fiscal deficit is widened by 2 points of GDP or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but if I can add, for example, what we see is pretty general. It's not just a few countries that have driven these results. It's a more broadly based vulnerability. So that also gives a sense that in somehow the confidence that vulnerability have increased.
Okay, so maybe we can bring the session to a close. Obviously, I'd like to thank Stefania and Sean for flying in from, I hear, very cold Washington to be with us, and to Liz and Ahmed for your comments. I think it'd be very interesting too. I mean, the discussion has been around the changing environment and these issues about vulnerability, rising vulnerability, but not excessive, but certainly something that we're all going to be watching. And of course, the SDGs as well, their implementation and the role that the IMF might play in that. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to hopefully next year see who was wrong and who was right on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.